November 1911, Evalyn Walsh McLean stands alone in the drawing room of her Washington mansion, a velvet box open in her hands. Inside lies the Hope Diamond, 45 carats of blue stone with a documented trail of dead owners. The jeweler had warned her. Her friends had warned her. She fastens it around her neck anyway. The room around her is perfect. Silk wallpaper from France, furniture carried across an ocean, servants waiting in distant hallways. She is 25 years old and can purchase anything that exists in the world. The diamond sits cold against her throat. She had bought it, she would later say, because someone told her not to. Because curses were superstition, and she had money enough to prove it. But in that moment, alone with the stone, there is something else. A need to own the most dangerous object available, to wear catastrophe as decoration, to tempt what wealth supposedly protects against. This is not a story about a curse. It is a story about a woman who spent 50 years surrounded by everything money could buy and almost nothing it could not. The darkness was there from the beginning, in the mining camps where her fortune was born, in the Washington ballrooms that refused her entry, in the marriage that looked like triumph and felt like transaction. The Hope Diamond would become the symbol, but the emptiness was already furnished and waiting. What follows is a life that moved from luxury to luxury while the center steadily collapsed. Evalyn was born in 1886 in a mining camp outside Leadville, Colorado, where her father, Thomas Walsh, worked, claims that produced nothing. The camp sat at 10,000 feet, a collection of tents and wooden structures clinging to a mountainside. Her mother, Carrie, washed clothes in water that froze overnight. There was no school. There was barely shelter. Evalyn's earliest memories were of cold and the sound of men digging. Her father was not a miner by training. He had been a carpenter in Ireland, then Massachusetts, then Colorado, following rumors of silver. For years, he found nothing. The family moved from camp to camp, always one winter away from leaving the mountains entirely. Evalyn wore the same dress until it split. Her brother drowned in a mining accident when she was 6. The family did not speak of it. Then, in 1896, when Evalyn was 10, her father purchased a supposedly exhausted claim called the Camp Bird Mine for $20,000 he did not have. Within 6 months, he had found a vein of gold ore so pure it required almost no processing. Within a year, he was extracting $50,000 worth of gold per month. Within 2 years, he was a millionaire several times over. The transformation was not gradual. One season, Evalyn was wearing miners' hand-me-downs. The next, she was dressed in velvet ordered from Denver. The family moved from a 2-room shack to a mansion in Ouray, then to a larger mansion in Denver. Her father installed electric lights, bought her a pony, hired tutors. She had never attended school and now had private teachers in subjects she did not understand. The lessons felt like punishments for a crime she had not committed. Her mother adapted by disappearing into the role of hostess. Carrie Walsh began giving parties for Denver society, elaborate dinners where she served food she had learned about from magazines. She wore gowns that arrived in boxes from the East Coast. She studied which fork to use. Evalyn watched her mother perform each gesture with visible concentration, as though wealth were a script to be memorized. Evalyn herself was placed in contexts she had no framework for understanding. At 12, she was sent to a private academy in Denver, where the other girls had been wealthy since birth. They recognized her immediately as something foreign. Her accent was wrong. Her manners were guessed at. She knew facts about ore processing and nothing about literature. The girls did not openly mock her. They were too well trained for that, but they arranged themselves in her absence. She ate lunch alone for 2 years. Her father seemed not to notice. Thomas Walsh was consumed with expansion, purchasing more claims, building processing facilities, buying real estate in Denver and San Francisco. He traveled constantly. When home, he spoke only of tonnage and yields. He had waited 40 years to strike gold, and now that he had it, he could not stop working. The money accumulated faster than he could spend it, but he behaved as though it might vanish if he looked away. Evalyn learned that wealth did not change what had already happened. She had been poor and now was not, but the space between remained visible. At 14, she was invited to a debutante party in Denver. and wore a dress that cost more than her father's first mining claim. The other girls wore similar dresses. They looked comfortable. She looked like she was in costume. A photographer took pictures. In them, Evalyn stands slightly apart from the group, her smile precise and unconvincing. Her father decided to solve the social problem with distance. In 1901, when Evalyn was 15, he moved the family to Washington, D.C. He had business there. Mining interests required political connections. But the unspoken reason was repositioning. In Colorado, they would always be new money from the camps. In Washington, they could be simply rich. They purchased a mansion on Massachusetts Avenue for $200,000 and began renovations that doubled the cost. Evalyn was given an entire floor. Her bedroom had hand-painted wallpaper and a private bathroom with a marble tub. She could stand at her window and see the homes of senators and railroad magnates. Her father believed proximity would translate to access. It did not. Washington society operated on lineage, not wealth. The families who mattered had been wealthy for generations, their fortunes built on land grants and shipping and old mercantile empires. They found mining money distasteful, too recent, too violent, too much like work. Thomas Walsh could buy the house next door, but could not buy entry to the drawing rooms inside it. Evalyn was enrolled in a finishing school where she was taught French and posture and how to enter a room. The other students were daughters of senators and Supreme Court justices. They had known each other since childhood. Evalyn arrived with more money than any of them, and no one to vouch for her. She learned that wealth without endorsement was just wealth, loud, obvious, and easy to ignore. Her father began hosting dinners, inviting politicians and their wives. The guests came, ate his food, drank his wine, and left without reciprocating. Invitations to their own homes did not arrive. Evalyn would sit at these dinners dressed in gowns that cost thousands, watching men speak to her father about legislation and mining rights, while their wives made polite conversation that led nowhere. After the guests departed, the house felt larger and emptier than it had before they arrived. She began spending her father's money with increasing freedom. At 16, she could walk into any shop in Washington and purchase whatever she wanted. She bought dresses she never wore, jewelry she kept in boxes, books she did not read. The transactions were easy and immediate. The shopkeepers called her Miss Walsh and wrapped everything beautifully. For the duration of the purchase, she was treated as though she mattered. Her mother grew quieter. Carrie Walsh had worked harder at assimilation than anyone, studying etiquette books, perfecting her wardrobe, while hosting teas that women attended once and never again. She began complaining of headaches, spending days in her room. The doctors found nothing. Her father suggested she needed rest and sent her to European spas where she took treatments for ailments that had no name. Evalyn was left alone in the mansion with servants who were paid to be present. At 17, Evalyn understood that her family had purchased everything except the one thing they had moved to Washington to obtain. They had the house, they had the furniture, they had the clothes and the carriages and the social credentials on paper. What they did not have was belonging, and no amount of money seemed capable of producing it. Her father continued to believe it was a problem of scale, a larger donation, a more impressive party, a better introduction. Evalyn was beginning to suspect it was something else entirely. The rejection was never loud. Washington society perfected the art of exclusion through silence. Invitations arrived for charity events where the Walshes could donate but not join the organizing committees. They were welcomed at public receptions and absent from private dinners. Evalyn learned to read the gap between politeness and inclusion. Her father interpreted this as a temporary obstacle. In 1902, he commissioned a complete renovation of their Massachusetts Avenue mansion, hiring architects who had designed homes for Vanderbilts. The project took 2 years and cost over $500,000. Marble was imported from Italy. Chandeliers came from France. The ballroom could hold 300 guests. Thomas Walsh believed that sufficient grandeur would force acknowledgement. The house opened in 1904 with a reception attended by 400 people. Senators came, cabinet members came, Supreme Court justices came. They toured the ballroom, admired the marble staircase, ate from silver platters, and left. Within a week, Evalyn's mother received thank you notes, but no return invitations. The mansion had become a tourist attraction, not a social anchor. Evalyn was 18 and understood what her father refused to see. The problem was not the house. The problem was origin. Washington's established families traced their wealth back far enough that its source had become irrelevant. Old shipping fortunes, colonial land grants, inheritances so ancient they felt genealogical rather than economic. The Walshes smelled of fresh dirt and dynamite. Their money was 10 years old and still carried the camps with it. She began appearing in the society pages, but only in ways that emphasized her separateness. Miss Evalyn Walsh wore a gown estimated at $5,000, the Washington Post reported after one event, a description that would never appear next to the names of women whose wealth was assumed rather than counted. She was becoming a spectacle, the mining heiress in expensive clothes, performing wealth for an audience that watched without admitting her. Her mother's health continued deteriorating. Carrie Walsh spent months at a time in Europe, moving between sanatoriums in Switzerland and rest cures in Germany. The doctors diagnosed neurasthenia, a condition that meant nothing except that she could not function in the life her husband had built. Evalyn accompanied her once, spending 6 weeks in a Swiss clinic where her mother took salt baths and ate prescribed meals while staring out windows. They barely spoke. When they returned to Washington, nothing had changed except that her mother now had medical language for her unhappiness. Evelyn's brother Vincent, younger by 4 years, was sent to boarding school in Massachusetts. Her father was traveling constantly between Washington, Colorado, and New York, managing his mining empire and purchasing more properties. Evalyn was left in the mansion with servants and a social calendar that felt like obligation. She attended teas where women spoke carefully around her. She went to charity luncheons where she was asked to donate but not to help organize. She was present at dozens of gatherings and invited to none of the conversations that mattered. In 1905, her father attempted a different strategy. He began hosting intellectual salons, inviting professors and writers and artists to the mansion for evening discussions. The idea was European, the kind of gathering where money became irrelevant next to ideas. He hired a curator to advise on art purchases, the walls filled with paintings by Corot and Millet. Musicians were brought in to perform. Evalyn sat through lectures on philosophy and poetry delivered to rooms full of people who treated the events as paid engagements rather than social occasions. The artists and professors came reliably because they were compensated. They gave talks, ate dinner, and departed. Some thanked Thomas Walsh for his patronage. None invited him to their homes or introduced him to their friends who were not for hire. Evalyn watched her father write checks to people who smiled at him and forgot him the moment they left. She was 19 when she began to understand that her father was not trying to join society. He was trying to purchase the feeling of having joined it. The distinction seemed important. He could buy attendance, deference, even admiration of a kind. What he could not buy was the casual intimacy of people who had known each other for decades and did not need to audition for each other's approval. Her own attempts at friendship followed the same pattern. She befriended other young women by offering things: use of her family's box at the theater, trips on her father's private railroad car, shopping expeditions where she paid for everything. The young women accepted. They were pleasant company. They wrote her thank you notes and included her in activities that required even numbers. But they did not confide in her. She was never invited to the smaller gatherings, the informal lunches, the overnight visits where real intimacy developed. One girl, the daughter of a State Department official, had seemed different. They had met at a charity event and discovered a shared interest in horses. For 3 months, they rode together twice a week. Evalyn felt something close to friendship. Then the girl became engaged, and the invitations stopped. Evalyn was not invited to the engagement party or the wedding. She learned about the marriage from the newspaper. The girl sent a brief note apologizing for the oversight, a polite lie that both of them understood. Evalyn began staying home. The mansion had a library she had never used, and a music room with a piano no one played. She took up painting because it required no audience. Her work was terrible. Clumsy landscapes that looked like the illustrations in children's books, but it filled hours. Her father saw the paintings and hired a professional instructor, an older woman from the Corcoran who came twice a week and corrected Evalyn's brushwork with patient condescension. The lessons felt like another performance of refinement that would lead nowhere. Her father bought her a car in 1906, one of the first automobiles in Washington. It was a gesture meant to signal modernity and independence. Evelyn learned to drive it herself, racing through Rock Creek Park at speeds that terrified her chaperone. The car became her escape, not from the city, but from the requirement of being seen. She could drive for hours, alone, without having to calibrate her behavior for people who were evaluating whether she belonged. At night, the mansion was enormous and silent. Her mother was usually in Europe. Her brother was at school. Her father worked in his study until late, reviewing reports from his mines. Evelyn would walk through the empty ballroom, her footsteps echoing off marble floors installed for parties that had not created the relationships they were designed to produce. The house was a stage set for a life that was not happening. Evelyn met Edward Beale McLean in the summer of 1906 at a horse race in Saratoga Springs. He was 20 years old. She was 19. He was drunk when they were introduced, laughing too loud at something that was not funny. She recognized the performance immediately, the studied carelessness of someone who had never needed to care. Ned McLean was the son of John R. McLean, who owned the Washington Post and the Cincinnati Enquirer. The family fortune was newspaper money, which made it more respectable than mining money, but not by much. The McLeans had purchased their way into Washington society a generation earlier and had mostly succeeded. Ned had been raised inside the circles that excluded Evelyn. He knew all the people she had been trying to meet. He also did not seem to care about any of them. Their first conversation lasted 10 minutes. Ned told her she looked bored. She told him she was. He suggested they leave the party and drive to Saratoga Lake. She went. They took his car and drove too fast on dark roads. He drank from a flask he kept under the seat. She did not ask him to slow down. They returned 3 hours later. Her chaperone was hysterical. Ned thought this was hilarious. Over the following weeks, they were seen together constantly. Ned pursued her with the determination of someone used to getting what he wanted immediately. He sent flowers every day. He appeared at her house unannounced. He invited her to dinners and races and weekend trips to his family's estate in Maryland. Evelyn's father approved. The McLeans were newspaper aristocracy, exactly the kind of connection Thomas Walsh had been trying to manufacture for years. But the courtship felt less like romance than mutual exhibition. Ned wanted to be seen with the richest heiress in Washington. Evelyn wanted access to the social world Ned moved through effortlessly. They attended parties together where people who had ignored Evelyn now spoke to her, because she arrived with Ned McLean. The conversations were not warmer, but they happened. Ned drank at every event, not socially, compulsively. He would arrive sober and be slurring by dinner. His friends found this charming. Evelyn found it predictable. He became loud, then argumentative, then sentimental. She learned to leave before the sentimentality arrived. He would apologize the next day with expensive gifts, jewelry, furs, once a racehorse she had mentioned admiring. The apologies were transactional, delivered with the confidence of someone who believed money erased behavior. They were engaged by Christmas, 6 months after meeting. The engagement was announced in both the Washington Post and the Cincinnati Enquirer, newspapers owned by Ned's father. The coverage was extensive: photographs, descriptions of the ring, speculation about the wedding. Evelyn appeared in print more in 1 week than in all her previous years in Washington combined. The attention felt validating and hollow at the same time. The engagement period lasted over a year. Ned's father insisted on a long courtship, though the reason given, allowing the couple to know each other better, seemed irrelevant. They already knew each other. Ned was charming when sober and cruel when drunk. Evelyn was willing to marry him anyway because he represented entry to a world that had been closed to her. Neither was under any illusion about what the marriage actually was. During the engagement, Ned's drinking worsened. He wrecked 2 cars in 3 months. He was arrested once for disorderly conduct at a club in New York, and his father paid to have the charges dismissed. At parties, he would disappear for hours and return disheveled, offering no explanation. Evelyn's friends, the few she had acquired through proximity to Ned, suggested she reconsider. She did not. Her father, meanwhile, was ecstatic. Thomas Walsh saw the marriage as the culmination of his social project, his daughter joining one of Washington's newspaper dynasties. He offered to pay for the wedding and the honeymoon. He suggested buying them a mansion as a wedding gift. Ned's father countered with his own mansion offer. The 2 men competed over who could give more, turning the marriage into a demonstration of wealth that had nothing to do with the people getting married. Evelyn's mother returned from Europe for the engagement announcement and left again within a month. Carrie Walsh attended one dinner with the McLean family and spent the entire evening silent. Afterward, she told Evalyn that Ned reminded her of men from the mining camps, violent and careless in ways that money made permissible rather than illegal. Evalyn did not argue. She also did not break the engagement. The wedding was planned for the summer of 1908. The preparations became their own spectacle. The ceremony would be at her family's estate in Newport, where Thomas Walsh had purchased a summer mansion he barely used. 200 guests were invited. The dress was ordered from Paris. 6 bridesmaids were chosen, all daughters of families that had previously excluded Evalyn but now accepted her proximity to the McLean family as sufficient credential. Ned gave her a diamond necklace 3 weeks before the wedding. It had belonged to his grandmother and was worth an estimated $50,000. He fastened it around her neck at a dinner party and announced that she would wear it at the ceremony. The gesture was public and possessive. The guests applauded. Evalyn felt the weight of the stones and understood that she was being claimed, not cherished. 2 weeks before the wedding, Ned arrived at her house at midnight, drunk and incoherent. He had wrecked another car. His face was cut from broken glass. He wanted to call off the wedding, then wanted to move it up, then wanted to elope immediately. Evalyn sent him home with his driver. The next morning, he sent roses and a bracelet. The wedding remained scheduled. Her father asked her once if she was certain. They were standing in the ballroom of the Massachusetts Avenue mansion, discussing seating arrangements for the reception. Thomas Walsh looked at her with something approaching concern. Evalyn told him she was certain. He nodded and returned to the seating chart. The conversation lasted less than a minute. The night before the wedding, Evalyn stood in her bedroom in Newport looking at her wedding dress hanging in lamplight. It was hand-embroidered with seed pearls and had cost $8,000. She thought about the mining camp where she was born, the cold rooms where her mother had washed clothes in frozen water. She thought about Ned McLean's drunken marriage proposal, delivered at a racetrack while he was losing money on horses. She fastened the diamond necklace around her neck and felt nothing in particular. The wedding was the next day. Everything was perfect. The weather cooperated. The ceremony went as planned. Photographs captured a bride who looked beautiful and composed. She was 21 years old and marrying a man she did not love to join a society that did not want her. They left for Europe 3 days after the wedding, sailing first class on a steamship where Ned drank steadily for the entire crossing. Evalyn spent most of the voyage in their cabin, claiming seasickness. The actual sickness was watching her new husband charm other passengers during dinner and then vomit in their bathroom at midnight. The other first-class travelers pretended not to notice. Wealth purchased discretion, if nothing else. They arrived in Paris in August 1908 with no itinerary and unlimited funds. Ned's father had given them $100,000 for the honeymoon. Evelyn's father had matched it. They checked into the Ritz and began spending with the frantic intensity of people trying to distract themselves from each other. Evalyn bought clothes she would never wear, trunks full of gowns from Worth and Paquin. Ned bought a car, then another car, then commissioned a custom automobile that would take 6 months to build. They attended the opera without listening. They ate at restaurants recommended by concierges and remembered nothing about the food. They were tourists performing the motions of enjoyment while feeling nothing. The fight started in the second week. Ned would disappear into Paris nightclubs and return at dawn. Evalyn would confront him. He would laugh at her, then apologize, then disappear again the next night. She learned that marriage had not changed his behavior. It had simply made her responsible for witnessing it. The hotel staff began to recognize the pattern. Raised voices in the evening, silence in the morning, expensive gifts delivered by afternoon. They moved to Monte Carlo in September. Ned gambled while Evalyn watched from the edges of casinos, holding drinks she did not finish. He lost thousands in single nights, amounts that did not matter because there was always more. She saw him win once, a substantial sum at roulette, and watched him immediately place the entire amount on the next spin and lose it. The loss made him angrier than the win had made him happy. One night at a Monte Carlo casino, Ned accused her of flirting with a French count who had asked her to dance. The accusation was absurd. She had declined the dance, but Ned was drunk and convinced. He made a scene loud enough that they were asked to leave. In the hotel, he broke a lamp. She locked herself in the bathroom. By morning, he had sent jewelry and flowers, and a note that did not apologize, but suggested they move on to the next city. They went to Switzerland, then Austria, then back to France. The travel had no purpose except motion. They stayed in the best hotels and saw nothing. Evalyn kept a diary for the first month, then abandoned it when she realized every entry was the same. Arrived, unpacked, waited for Ned to return, argued, slept alone. In October, they were driving through the French countryside in one of Ned's new automobiles. He was driving too fast on narrow roads designed for carriages. Evalyn told him to slow down. He accelerated. She stopped asking. They came around a curve, and there was a farmer's cart blocking the road. Ned swerved, overcorrected, and the car left the road entirely. They hit a stone wall at 40 miles per hour. The impact threw Evalyn forward into the dashboard. She felt her ribs crack before she understood what had happened. Ned was unconscious, bleeding from his head. The car was destroyed. The farmer whose cart they had tried to avoid ran for help while Evalyn sat in the wreckage, unable to move without pain that made her vision darken. They were taken to a hospital in a nearby town. Evalyn had broken 3 ribs and fractured her collarbone. Ned had a concussion and deep lacerations across his face and chest. They spent 2 weeks in adjacent hospital rooms. The doctors spoke French that Evalyn barely understood. Ned developed an infection and was delirious for days, shouting at people who were not there. When he recovered enough to speak coherently, he told her the accident was her fault. If she had not been criticizing his driving, he would not have been distracted. The logic was insane, but he believed it. She did not argue. Her ribs hurt too much to sustain a conversation. They remained in France for another month while they healed. Ned's father sent money and lawyers to handle the property damage. Evalyn's father sent a doctor from America who examined her and said she had been fortunate. The injuries could have been much worse. She did not feel fortunate. She felt trapped in a foreign country with a husband who had nearly killed them both and blamed her for it. By the time they could travel, winter had arrived. They moved to the French Riviera, where the weather was milder, and Ned could recuperate in comfort. He hired a valet who understood that his primary job was to keep Ned supplied with alcohol while maintaining the appearance of sobriety. Evalyn hired a nurse, then dismissed her when the woman's competence made Evalyn's helplessness more obvious. The physical intimacy of marriage had been sporadic before the accident. After, it stopped entirely. They maintained separate bedrooms. Ned would come to her room occasionally, usually drunk, and she would turn away until he left. Once he forced the issue, and she submitted without resistance or response. He never tried again. The marriage became a cohabitation of 2 people who had signed a contract and were now serving out its terms. In December, Evalyn discovered she was pregnant. The realization came when the nurse she had dismissed was called back to examine her for what Evalyn thought was a lingering injury from the accident. The nurse confirmed the pregnancy with the kind of professional neutrality that made clear she understood exactly what kind of marriage she was observing. Evalyn told Ned in their hotel suite in Nice. He was holding a glass of champagne. He set it down, stood up, embraced her briefly, and then picked the glass back up and finished it. He said he was happy. His face showed nothing. He sent a telegram to his father and hers. Within hours, congratulatory messages arrived from both families. The newspapers in Washington ran announcements. The heir to 2 newspaper fortunes would be born to continue the dynasty. They stayed in Europe through Christmas. Ned gave her emeralds. She gave him cufflinks. They attended a party at another American family's villa, where everyone pretended their marriage looked normal. Evalyn wore a loose dress that hid her pregnancy and smiled through conversations about how wonderful Europe must be for newlyweds. They sailed back to America in January 1909. 6 months after leaving. The honeymoon had cost nearly $200,000. They had nothing to show for it except broken bones that had healed and a child neither of them had planned. The crossing was rough. Evalyn was seasick for most of the voyage. Ned drank in the ship's bar and told other passengers stories about their European adventures that bore no resemblance to what had actually happened. They returned to Washington and moved into a mansion on I Street that Ned's father had purchased for them as a wedding gift. The house had 30 rooms and a staff of 12. Evalyn was 22, pregnant, and living with a husband who spent most nights at his club. The servants unpacked trunks from Europe while she walked through empty rooms, trying to determine which one should be the nursery. The baby was born in July 1909, a son they named Evalyn Walsh McLean. The delivery was difficult. Evalyn hemorrhaged and spent 2 weeks in bed recovering while a wet nurse fed the child. Ned came to see the baby once, held him awkwardly for less than a minute, and left. His father sent a case of champagne. Her father sent a silver rattle that had belonged to European royalty and cost more than most families earned in a year. Evalyn recovered slowly. The doctors said she could have more children, but should wait. She spent hours in the nursery watching the nurse handle Vincent with a competence that made Evalyn feel obsolete. When she tried to hold him, he cried. The nurse would take him back, and he would quiet immediately. Evalyn began avoiding the nursery. Ned's drinking had progressed from recreational to constant. He would leave the house in the morning and return after midnight, if he returned at all. Sometimes he slept at his club. Sometimes he slept at his father's house. He was running the Washington Post in name only. His father still made every significant decision. Ned's job was to appear at the office occasionally and not cause scandals visible enough to damage the paper's reputation. Evalyn was left alone in the I Street mansion with servants and a baby she did not know how to mother. Her own mother was in Europe again, taking treatments for an illness that had no diagnosis. Her father was in Colorado managing his mines. She had no friends. The women who had briefly included her during the engagement had returned to their own lives after the wedding. She was Mrs. Edward McLean now, which meant something on paper and nothing in practice. In 1910, Ned's behavior forced a reckoning. He wrecked another car, this time injuring a pedestrian. His father paid the hospital bills and the settlement. The incident was kept out of the Washington Post, but appeared in other papers. Evalyn read about her husband's accident in the Baltimore Sun before Ned bothered to mention it. When she confronted him, he told her to stop reading newspapers. She began taking laudanum for headaches that appeared with increasing frequency. The doctor prescribed it freely. It was common for women of her class, a solution to problems that had no other name. The drug made the days softer and less distinct. She could spend hours in the drawing room, time passing without her noticing. The servants learned not to disturb her in the afternoons. Ned's father died in June 1916. The death was unexpected, a heart attack at 64. Ned inherited control of the Washington Post and the Cincinnati Enquirer, along with an estate worth an estimated $20 million. He was 29 years old and one of the richest men in America. The responsibility sobered him for approximately 3 weeks. Evalyn inherited her own fortune the same year. Her father died in April, also from a heart attack. Thomas Walsh left her $7 million outright, along with mining properties and real estate that would generate income indefinitely. She was 30 years old and independently wealthy beyond any practical need. The money changed nothing about her daily life except that now she could spend it without asking permission. The dual inheritances meant that she and Ned together controlled newspaper empires and mining fortunes worth over $30 million. They were one of the wealthiest couples in America. They barely spoke to each other. Ned spent his inheritance on cars, racehorses, and a yacht he used twice. Evalyn spent hers on houses she rarely visited and jewelry she wore to events that bored her. In 1911, Pierre Cartier came to Washington with the Hope Diamond. The stone had a documented history of dead owners: French royalty guillotined, an Ottoman sultan deposed, a Greek merchant whose family died in accidents. Cartier had purchased it from the estate of the last owner, whose son had died in poverty. The jeweler brought it to Evalyn specifically because he knew she bought things other people warned her against. He showed her the diamond in her drawing room. It was 45 carats, deep blue, set in a chain of white diamonds. Cartier recited its history, the curse, the deaths, the misfortunes that had followed it across centuries. He told her multiple owners had tried to sell it and failed because no one would purchase a cursed object. Evalyn listened to the entire recitation and then asked the price: $180,000. Cartier waited. Evalyn looked at the stone under lamplight. It was beautiful in a way that felt dangerous, a piece of concentrated night. She told Cartier she would need to think about it. He left the diamond with her overnight, confident in what her decision would be. She wore it that evening, alone in her bedroom, fastening it around her neck and looking at herself in the mirror. The diamond sat cold against her skin. She thought about the warnings, the curse, the trail of misfortune. Then she thought about her life, the childhood in mining camps, the rejection by Washington society, the marriage to a drunk, the loneliness of wealth that bought everything except meaning. What exactly did she have to lose that a curse could take? She purchased the diamond the next morning. Cartier was unsurprised. The transaction took 10 minutes. She wrote a check and he gave her a velvet box containing the most infamous piece of jewelry in the world. She wore it to a dinner party that night. People stared. Some asked if it was real. She confirmed that it was. A woman asked if she was worried about the curse. Evalyn said she was not superstitious, but she was not entirely unaffected either. She had the diamond blessed by a priest, a hedge against belief she claimed not to hold. She wore it constantly, to parties, to the opera, sometimes just around the house. It became her signature, the thing people mentioned when they mentioned her. Evalyn McLean, the woman who wore the cursed diamond. The curse, if it existed, would have to wait its turn. Her life was already its own accumulation of small disasters, a marriage that was a performance, children she could not connect with, wealth that purchased everything except the feeling of being alive. The hope diamond sat against her throat like a diagnosis she had paid to receive. Vincent was 2 years old when Evalyn had her second child, a daughter named Evalyn Walsh McLean Jr., born in 1912. The delivery was easier than the first, but Evelyn's response was the same. She hired a nurse immediately. The baby was fed, changed, and cared for by staff, while Evalyn recovered in a separate wing of the house. When visitors came to see the new baby, Evalyn would appear briefly, accept congratulations, and leave the nurse to handle the actual infant. Ned barely acknowledged the second child's existence. He was occupied with running the Washington Post into patterns of sensationalism that increased circulation and decreased respectability. He also began an affair with a showgirl from New York, a relationship he did not bother hiding. Evalyn learned about it from the household staff, who had heard about it from Ned's driver. She said nothing. The marriage had become an arrangement where infidelity was less relevant than maintaining appearances. A third child arrived in 1915, another son named Edward Beale McLean Jr., called Nettie. Evalyn was 29 and had 3 children she felt no instinctive connection to. She tried. She would sit with them in the nursery, watching them play under the supervision of their nannies. She felt like a visitor in a space that belonged to someone else. The children preferred the nannies, who were consistent and present. Evalyn was neither. Then, in 1916, Charles Lindbergh's infant son was kidnapped from his home in New Jersey. The case consumed the newspapers for weeks, the ransom notes, the nationwide search, the eventual discovery of the child's body. Evalyn read every article. The story lodged in her mind with the intensity of a prophecy. Wealthy families were targets. Children could be taken. Money made you vulnerable rather than safe. She became obsessed with security. The I Street mansion was already staffed with servants, but now she hired armed guards. 2 men were stationed at the front gate at all times. 2 more patrolled the grounds. A 5th guard was assigned to follow the children whenever they left the property. She had bars installed on the nursery windows, then worried the bars would trap the children in a fire and had them removed. She commissioned a complete security assessment of the house. Consultants examined every entrance, every window, every possible point of access. They recommended locks, alarms, reinforced doors. Evalyn approved everything. The house began to feel like a fortress. The children grew up surrounded by guards and restrictions they were too young to understand. Vincent was 7 by then, old enough to notice. He asked why there were always men with guns outside his bedroom. Evalyn told him they were there to keep him safe. He asked what they were keeping him safe from. She had no answer that would not terrify him, so she said nothing and left the room. The nanny explained it differently, told him the guards were like knights protecting a castle. He seemed satisfied with that. The guards became part of the household routine. They accompanied the children to school. They waited outside playgrounds. They sat in cars during birthday parties. The other children's parents noticed. Some asked questions. Evalyn explained that she took security seriously. The other parents nodded politely and began limiting their children's visits to the McLean house, uncomfortable with the armed presence. Evalyn installed a telephone system throughout the mansion that allowed her to check on the children from any room. She would call the nursery multiple times per day, asking the nanny for updates. The children were fine. They were always fine. But Evalyn needed to confirm it repeatedly, as though vigilance could prevent disaster through sheer repetition. She began keeping the children home more often. School was dangerous. Too many people, too many opportunities for something to go wrong. She hired private tutors instead. The children would have lessons in the mansion, supervised by teachers who had been investigated and cleared by the guards. Vincent protested. He wanted to attend school with other children. Evalyn told him it was not safe. He was 8 years old and beginning to understand that his mother's fear was stronger than his preferences. The isolation extended to play dates and social activities. Evalyn would allow other children to visit, but only under conditions she controlled. The visiting children and their nannies would be searched at the door. The guards would monitor the playroom. The children played under observation, aware they were being watched. Gradually, the invitations from other families stopped coming. The McLean children were too difficult to accommodate. Evalyn purchased a country estate in Virginia, Friendship, a sprawling property with 60 acres. She had it fenced entirely. More guards were hired. The estate became a second fortress, a place where the children could play outside, but only within boundaries she had defined and secured. She moved the family there for summers, away from Washington's heat and closer to a controlled environment. But physical proximity did not create emotional connection. Evalyn could see her children at all times, could confirm their safety every hour, and still felt nothing close to what she imagined maternal love should feel like. She provided everything: security, education, material comfort. What she could not provide was presence. Even when she was in the same room, she felt absent, watching from a distance she could not cross. The children learned to adapt. Vincent became quiet and obedient, a child who understood that his mother's anxiety required his cooperation. Young Evalyn was more resistant, crying when the guards restricted her movements. Nettie was still too young to understand. The household revolved around Evelyn's fear, and the children grew up inside it. Ned ignored the entire apparatus. He found the security measures excessive and said so, then left for his club and forgot about it. He saw the children occasionally, usually when they were brought to him by nannies. He would pat their heads, ask brief questions, and dismiss them. His relationship with them was ceremonial. He acknowledged their existence but took no responsibility for their daily lives. Evalyn began taking more laudanum. The headaches were constant now, a physical manifestation of anxiety that never resolved. The drug helped. It made the hours pass more smoothly. She could check on the children, confirm they were safe, and return to her room where time moved differently. The doctors continued prescribing it. No one suggested it might be a problem. At night she would walk through the mansion, checking locks. The guards knew her routine and did not question it. She would go to the nursery and watch the children sleep, their faces peaceful in lamplight. She felt the hope diamond against her throat, cold and heavy. The curse had not taken them yet. Her vigilance had not failed yet. She could maintain this, the constant monitoring, the endless precautions, indefinitely. She had no choice. The alternative was unthinkable. The children grew older inside walls that protected them from nothing except normalcy. By 1920, the Friendship Estate in McLean, Virginia, had become Evalyn's primary residence. The property sprawled across 60 acres of manicured grounds, with a main house that had been expanded to 75 rooms. She spent over $2 million on renovations, adding wings, installing fountains, building a swimming pool large enough for Olympic competitions. The estate had its own power plant, its own water system, its own private zoo with peacocks and exotic birds. She began hosting weekend parties that became famous in Washington society. The invitations went to senators, cabinet members, Supreme Court justices, foreign diplomats, anyone with power or proximity to it. 200 guests was typical. 300 was not unusual. The parties would begin Friday evening and continue through Sunday afternoon, a continuous stream of meals, entertainment, and orchestrated leisure. The guests arrived to find their rooms already prepared, their names on doors, their preferences anticipated. Fresh flowers were changed twice daily. Servants were instructed to be invisible, except when needed. The food came from Evalyn's own kitchens, elaborate multi-course dinners prepared by chefs imported from New York. The wine cellar held bottles worth thousands. Everything was perfect, and nothing was spared. Evalyn designed activities to fill every hour. There were tennis tournaments on private courts, swimming competitions in the pool, horseback riding through trails she had carved through the woods, movies screened in a private theater, musical performances by orchestras hired for the weekend. The guests were never left alone, never given space to be bored or to leave early. She hired entire dance bands from New York. On Saturday nights, the ballroom would fill with music and movement, couples dancing under chandeliers while Evalyn watched from the edges. She rarely danced herself. She would circulate instead, ensuring that drinks were refreshed, that introductions were made, that no guest felt neglected. Her role was hostess and stage manager, creating the appearance of spontaneous enjoyment through meticulous orchestration. The parties had a formula. Political rivals would be seated together at dinner, forced into proximity that might lead to compromise or alliance. Evalyn kept notes on who knew whom, who needed an introduction, who might benefit from a private conversation. She arranged encounters like a strategist, using her estate as neutral territory where Washington's power brokers could meet outside formal contexts. People came because attendance meant something. An invitation to friendship indicated you mattered. The guest lists were published in the society pages. Politicians needed to be seen there. Diplomats needed to attend. Refusing an invitation suggested you were either irrelevant or hostile to the McLean family's considerable influence. The parties were social currency, and Evalyn was minting it. But she had no close friends among the hundreds who came. The relationships were transactional. She provided access and luxury. They provided attendance and the appearance of intimacy. Conversations at friendship were political strategy or social performance. No one confided in her. No one stayed because they enjoyed her company. They stayed because the weekend was valuable to their careers or social standing. Ned attended the parties intermittently. Sometimes he would be present for the entire weekend, charming guests and drinking steadily. Other times he would appear only for Saturday dinner, then disappear to Washington or New York. His absences were noted but not discussed. The guests understood that the McLean marriage was a public arrangement, not a private relationship. Evalyn's role was to maintain the estate and the social calendar. Ned's role was to control the Washington Post and spend money. The children were largely absent from the parties. They lived in a separate wing of the house with their nannies and tutors. Occasionally, Evalyn would bring them out to be displayed. Vincent was 11, young Evalyn was 8, Nettie was 5. The children would be introduced to important guests, would perform brief greetings, and then would be returned to their wing. They were proof of the family's continuity, not participants in its social life. Evalyn's mother died in 1922, in a sanatorium in Switzerland where she had spent the last 3 years. Carrie Walsh had never recovered from the transition from mining camp to mansion. The news reached Evalyn during a party weekend. She read the telegram in her private study. Alone, she did not cancel the party. The guests were informed at dinner. Condolences were offered. The party continued. Evalyn's mother was buried in Colorado without her daughter present. Evalyn sent flowers and remained at Friendship, hosting senators. The parties grew larger and more elaborate. Evalyn added a golf course to the property. She built cabanas around the pool. She installed a complete gym and spa facility. The improvements cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and were used by guests who came once or twice and forgot about them. The estate became a museum of hospitality, every amenity available, and none creating lasting connection. She began collecting people the way she collected jewelry, acquiring them for display rather than use. She befriended Alice Roosevelt Longworth, Theodore Roosevelt's daughter, a woman known for her sharp wit and political connections. Their friendship was performed in public, mentioned in columns, photographed at events. In private, they had little to say to each other. Alice attended friendship parties because they were useful. Evalyn invited her because her presence elevated the guest list. The same pattern held with other relationships. Evalyn cultivated senators' wives, cabinet members' daughters, anyone connected to power. She would give them gifts, invite them to intimate lunches, include them in smaller gatherings. They accepted her generosity and remained fundamentally separate. Years could pass without a genuine conversation. The relationships were architectures of obligation, not affection. At night, after the guests had retired to their rooms, Evalyn would walk the grounds alone. The estate was beautiful in darkness, the fountains lit from below, the gardens arranged in patterns visible only from the upper windows. She wore the hope diamond even when walking by herself, the stone heavy against her throat. The property was hers, The parties were successful, the guests returned repeatedly. She had created exactly what she had set out to create. She felt nothing close to satisfaction. The parties ended and the guests left, and the estate was empty again except for servants. The rooms that had been full of laughter on Saturday were silent by Monday. The entertainment she had orchestrated vanished as though it had never happened. The friendships she believed she had built dissolved the moment the weekend concluded. She began planning the next party before the current one ended. The invitations would go out, the responses would arrive, the guests would come, the cycle would repeat. She had purchased access to Washington society through relentless hospitality, but she could not stop hosting without losing the access. The parties had become mandatory, a performance she had to sustain indefinitely. The children watched from windows as cars arrived and departed carrying people their mother called friends, but who never asked about them. May 18, 1919. Vincent was 9 years old. The family was spending the weekend at Friendship, though no party was scheduled. Evalyn was in her bedroom recovering from one of her headaches. Ned was in Washington. The children were playing near the front of the estate with their nannies and guards watching from a distance. Vincent had been riding his bicycle on the long driveway that led from the main road to the house. The guards had cleared him to do so. The driveway was private property, gated and supposedly safe. He had ridden it dozens of times before. Young Evalyn and Nettie were playing nearby on the lawn. The nannies were watching all three children, dividing attention between them. A car came through the gate. The driver was a family friend arriving unexpectedly. He was traveling too fast on the curved driveway. Vincent came around a blind turn on his bicycle. The driver saw him too late. He tried to brake. The car struck Vincent and threw him 15 feet into the landscaping beside the drive. The nannies heard the impact before they saw it. By the time they reached him, Vincent was unconscious and bleeding from his head. The guards ran to help. Someone called for a doctor. Someone else ran to tell Evalyn. She came down from her room still in her dressing gown, the laudanum making everything slow and unreal. Vincent was carried into the house and laid on a sofa in the main parlor. The doctor arrived within 20 minutes. He examined the boy and said nothing. Evalyn stood watching, her hands gripping the hope diamond around her neck. The doctor worked for half an hour, then stood and told her there was nothing to be done. The skull fracture was too severe. Vincent died without regaining consciousness. Evalyn did not scream. She did not cry. She stood perfectly still, looking at her son's body on the sofa. The doctor asked if she wanted him to call anyone. She said to call Ned. Then she walked upstairs to her bedroom and closed the door. The servants heard nothing from the room for hours. Ned arrived from Washington in the evening. He went directly to the parlor where Vincent's body remained. He stayed there for 10 minutes, then went to find Evalyn. She was sitting in her bedroom in darkness. He asked her what happened. She told him. He asked where the other children were. She did not know. He left to find them. Young Evalyn and Nettie had been taken to their wing by the nannies who tried to explain what had happened in language children might understand. Young Evalyn understood. She was 7 and had seen her brother carried into the house bleeding. Nettie was 4 and confused. The nannies kept them away from the parlor, away from their parents, trying to create distance from something that could not be escaped. The funeral was 4 days later. Hundreds attended. Senators, cabinet members, everyone who had ever been to a friendship party. The service was at St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington. Evalyn wore black and the Hope Diamond. She sat in the front pew between Ned and young Evalyn. Nettie was considered too young to attend. The service lasted an hour. Evalyn did not cry during any of it. The newspapers covered the death extensively. Tragedy strikes McLean family, the Washington Post reported, describing Vincent as a bright, promising boy taken too soon. The coverage mentioned the guards, the security measures, the irony that the child had died on his own property, despite all precautions. Evalyn did not read the articles. Ned had them removed from the house. After the funeral, Evalyn went to her bedroom and did not emerge for 2 weeks. The doctor was called. He prescribed more laudanum and sedatives. She took them and slept for days at a time. When she was awake, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The servants brought food she did not eat. Ned came to check on her once, saw that she was alive, and left again. When she finally came downstairs, she went directly to the liquor cabinet and poured herself a glass of whiskey. She had never been a serious drinker before. That had been Ned's domain. But now she drank the whiskey in 3 swallows and poured another. The alcohol worked faster than laudanum and required less pretense. She could be drunk by noon and no one would question it. Ned was drinking more as well. The two of them moved through friendship like ghosts, rarely speaking, occasionally crossing paths in hallways. He would be drunk by evening. She would be drunk by afternoon. They attended no parties. They hosted nothing. The estate that had been full of people every weekend sat empty, except for servants who had nothing to do. Young Evalyn and Nettie were forgotten in the grief. The nannies continued their routines, lessons, meals, bedtime. The children asked about their brother and were told he was in heaven. They asked about their parents and were told they were sad and needed time. Weeks passed. The parents remained absent. The children adapted to a household where they were fed and clothed, but fundamentally alone. 3 months after Vincent's death, Evalyn tried to resume the parties. She sent out invitations for a weekend in August. The responses were cautious. People were unsure if it was appropriate to attend. She insisted it was. The party happened. 70 guests came instead of the usual 200. They were subdued, uncomfortable. Evalyn drank through the entire weekend and was visibly intoxicated by Saturday dinner. The guests left early. She did not try hosting again for a year. Ned stopped coming to Friendship almost entirely. He stayed in Washington, running the Post and drinking at his club. When he did visit, he and Evalyn would drink together in hostile silence. Once they had a screaming fight that the servants heard from 3 rooms away. Evalyn accused him of not caring about Vincent. Ned accused her of caring too late. Neither accusation was fair, and both were true. The driver who had hit Vincent was never charged. He had been a family friend, the accident was ruled unavoidable, and the McLeans did not press for prosecution. Evalyn asked once why he was not in jail. Ned told her it would not bring Vincent back. She knew that. She wanted him in jail anyway. Ned refused to pursue it. The driver left Washington and was never mentioned again. Evalyn had the driveway torn up. She had the entire section where Vincent was hit removed and replaced with lawn. The curve where the accident happened was eliminated. The area was planted with flowers. She never looked at it. The guards remained, still protecting the remaining children from threats that came from inside the gates. In 1922, rumors began circulating in Washington about oil leases in Wyoming and California. The Teapot Dome scandal, as it would be called, involved Interior Secretary Albert Fall secretly leasing federal oil reserves to private companies in exchange for personal payments. The story was complicated and involved multiple government officials, oil executives, and substantial bribes disguised as loans. Ned McLean's Washington Post was supposed to investigate. Instead, Ned became part of the story. Albert Fall was a friend. They had vacationed together, gambled together, drunk together for years. When Fall needed money to cover the bribes he had accepted, he approached Ned for a loan. Ned gave him $100,000 in cash, no questions asked, no documentation required. The loan was discovered during a Senate investigation in late 1923. Ned was called to testify. He claimed the loan was innocent, just helping a friend in financial difficulty. The senators did not believe him. The questioning lasted hours. They asked when he had given Fall the money. He could not remember exactly. They asked why he had not documented the loan. He said friends did not require paperwork. They asked if he knew about the oil leases. He said he did not. The testimony was published in newspapers across the country. The Washington Post, which Ned owned, had to report on its own publisher's involvement in a federal corruption scandal. The coverage was restrained, buried on inside pages. Other papers were less forgiving. The New York Times ran the story on the front page. Ned McLean was described as either complicit in the bribery or willfully blind to it. Neither interpretation was flattering. Evalyn watched the scandal unfold from Friendship. She had met Albert Fall socially dozens of times. He had attended parties at the estate. She had never paid attention to his politics or his business dealings. Now his corruption was connected to her family. The McLean name was in headlines next to words like bribery and conspiracy. The invitations to other people's parties stopped arriving. Ned was drinking more heavily than ever. He would disappear for days, then surface at Friendship or the I Street house, disheveled and incoherent. Evalyn tried to manage the situation the only way she knew how, with money. She hired lawyers to represent Ned. She hired publicity consultants to improve his image. She made donations to political allies who might provide cover. The expenses ran into hundreds of thousands of dollars. The lawyers advised Ned to distance himself from Fall. He refused. Fall was his friend, he said, and he would not abandon him. The loyalty was admirable in theory and disastrous in practice. Ned's continued association with Fall made him look complicit. The Senate investigation expanded. More questions were asked. More testimony was required. Ned's answers became increasingly evasive. In early 1924, Ned was subpoenaed again. This time he claimed illness and refused to appear. The Senate threatened him with contempt. Evalyn intervened. She contacted senators she knew from friendship parties, calling in whatever favors she had accumulated through years of hospitality. Some helped, some did not. The contempt charge was dropped, but Ned's reputation was destroyed. The Washington Post's circulation began to decline. Advertisers withdrew. The paper was still profitable, but the scandal had damaged its credibility. Readers questioned how a publisher under investigation for corruption could run an independent newspaper. Ned insisted on remaining in control. His father had built the Post. He would not surrender it because of political attacks. Evalyn tried to resume normal social life. She hosted a party at Friendship in the spring of 1924. 50 invitations went out. 20 people came. The weekend was strained. Guests who had previously been comfortable now seemed cautious. Conversations avoided politics. No one mentioned the scandal directly, but it was present in every silence. By Sunday afternoon, half the guests had invented reasons to leave early. She realized that the parties had been built on a foundation that no longer existed. Washington society tolerated the McLeans because they had money and influence. The money remained, but the influence was tainted. Ned's testimony had made them look corrupt or stupid, possibly both. The invitations she had used to purchase social access were no longer sufficient. People were reassessing whether the McLean connection was worth maintaining. Ned stopped attending social events entirely. He would stay in Washington or travel to New York, drinking in clubs where no one knew about Senate investigations. Evalyn received reports from his staff. He had been seen at a speakeasy. He had been asked to leave a restaurant. He had crashed another car. The reports came regularly, a catalog of deterioration she was powerless to stop. She tried confronting him once. He came to Friendship in the summer of 1924, drunk and hostile. She told him he needed to stop drinking, needed to repair his reputation, needed to take responsibility for the scandal he had helped create. He laughed at her. He said she was the one who needed the Hope Diamond to feel important. He said their marriage was a transaction, and she had received exactly what she had paid for. He left before she could respond. The investigation continued through 1924 and into 1925. Albert Fall was eventually convicted of accepting bribes and sentenced to prison. Ned was never charged. The prosecutors determined they could not prove he had known about the corruption, but the absence of charges did not restore his reputation. He remained associated with the scandal, his name appearing in every article about Teapot Dome. The Washington Post began losing money. Ned's management was erratic. He would make decisions while drunk that had to be reversed by editors. He hired and fired staff impulsively. The paper's quality declined. Competitors gained circulation. By 1926, the Post was profitable only because of its monopoly on certain Washington advertising, not because of journalistic quality. Evalyn watched her husband destroy himself and could do nothing except pay for the damage. She covered his debts when he gambled badly. She paid settlements when he caused accidents. She maintained the appearance of a marriage that had become purely financial. They were business partners managing a shared catastrophe, nothing more. The parties at Friendship became infrequent. When Evalyn did host, attendance was sparse. The senators who had once competed for invitations now sent regrets. The Supreme Court justices were busy. The diplomats had other obligations. The estate that had been the center of Washington's social life was becoming irrelevant. Evalyn had purchased access through hospitality, and the purchase was being revoked. She sat in the empty ballroom one evening in late 1926, alone except for servants. The room was unchanged. The same chandeliers, the same marble floors, the same perfection. What had changed was the people. They were no longer coming. The parties had stopped working. The influence she had built through a decade of weekends had evaporated in 2 years of scandal. She wore the Hope Diamond and felt the weight of it. The curse, if it existed, was subtle. It did not kill dramatically. It just removed things gradually, until nothing remained but the stone itself. Ned's mental collapse became undeniable in 1927. He had always been erratic, but now the behavior crossed into something clinical. He would disappear for weeks, then surface in other cities with no memory of how he had gotten there. He accused staff members of conspiracies that did not exist. He gave interviews to rival newspapers claiming the Washington Post was trying to poison him. The editors had to issue retractions. In March of that year, he was found wandering in Baltimore, barefoot and confused. The police brought him to a hospital. Evalyn was called. By the time she arrived, Ned was sedated and strapped to a bed. The doctors told her he had been ranting about enemies who were following him. He had tried to fight the police officers who had picked him up. They recommended psychiatric evaluation. Evalyn brought him back to friendship. She hired private nurses to watch him continuously. For 2 weeks, he seemed stable, quiet, subdued, compliant. Then he attacked one of the nurses, convinced she was working for people who wanted to take the Washington Post. The nurse was not seriously injured, but the incident made clear that home care was insufficient. The doctors recommended institutionalization. They used careful language: rest, treatment, supervised care. What they meant was a psychiatric hospital. Evalyn resisted initially. Committing her husband would make the deterioration public and permanent. As long as Ned was at Friendship, she could maintain the fiction that he was simply unwell and recovering. Once he was institutionalized, there would be no pretending. But by summer, she had no choice. Ned's paranoia intensified. He believed Evalyn was stealing his money. He believed his own staff were spying on him. He would lock himself in rooms for days, refusing to eat or speak to anyone. When forced to come out, he would be violent. The nurses could not control him. The guards were called multiple times to restrain him. In August 1927, Evalyn had Ned committed to Shepherd Pratt Hospital in Baltimore. The facility specialized in treating wealthy patients with mental illness. Discreet, expensive, equipped to handle difficult cases. Ned was admitted under a false name to avoid publicity. The commitment papers described him as suffering from acute alcoholism and associated psychosis. He was 41 years old. The first few weeks, Evalyn visited regularly. She would drive to Baltimore and sit with Ned in the hospital's visiting room. Sometimes he recognized her. Sometimes he did not. Sometimes he would apologize for everything: the drinking, the affairs, the scandals. Other times he would accuse her of having him imprisoned. The conversations had no pattern. She stopped trying to predict them. By October, the visits became less frequent. Once a week, then once every 2 weeks. The doctors said Ned was not improving. The alcoholism had caused permanent damage. Even if he stopped drinking entirely, which he had no choice about in the hospital, the mental deterioration would likely continue. They suggested Evalyn prepare for the possibility that he might never leave Shepherd Pratt. She filed for legal separation in early 1928. Not divorce. That would have required grounds and public proceedings. Legal separation allowed her to control the finances while keeping the marriage technically intact. Ned's share of the McLean fortune was placed in a trust managed by his lawyers. Evalyn retained control of Friendship and the I Street house. The Washington Post remained in Ned's name, though he no longer had any involvement in its operations. The children asked about their father. Young Evalyn was 16 and understood more than she said. Neddy was 12 and confused about why his father had disappeared. Evalyn told them Ned was sick and needed special care. She did not use the word asylum. She did not explain the nature of his illness. The children learned not to ask follow-up questions. Ned would remain at Shepherd Pratt for the rest of his life, another 14 years. Evalyn's visits became rare, then stopped entirely by 1930. She would call the hospital occasionally to check on his status. The reports were always the same: stable but not improving, lucid some days and delusional others, no prospect of release. He had become a permanent patient, a person erased from daily life but still legally her husband. The marriage ended without ending. Evalyn was neither wife nor widow. She could not remarry because Ned was alive. She could not pretend to be married because Ned was locked in a psychiatric hospital in Baltimore. She existed in a strange middle status, legally bound to a man who no longer existed in her life. She continued wearing her wedding ring. When asked about Ned, she would say he was receiving treatment for nervous exhaustion. The phrase meant nothing, and everyone knew it. but it allowed conversations to continue without requiring truth. Washington society understood that the McLean marriage had dissolved into institutions and legal arrangements. No one mentioned it directly. The children grew up without a father. Nettie, in particular, seemed damaged by the absence. He was quiet, withdrawn, struggling in school. Evalyn hired tutors, then sent him to boarding school, then brought him back when the school reported behavioral problems. Nothing worked. The boy was lost in ways she could not address because she barely knew him. Young Evalyn turned to rebellion. At 17, she was drinking at parties, dating men Evalyn disapproved of, staying out until dawn. Evalyn would confront her, and the girl would laugh. "You drink every day," young Evalyn would say. "Why can't I?" The argument had no answer. Evelyn's own alcohol consumption had become constant. Wine with lunch, whiskey in the afternoon, champagne at dinner. The doctors continued prescribing laudanum as well. She was never sober and never quite drunk, existing in a medicated haze that made the days passable. Friendship felt enormous and empty. The parties had stopped almost entirely. Evalyn would occasionally invite a small group for dinner, but the gatherings were subdued and brief. The estate that had been built for entertaining hundreds now housed a woman alone with her servants and her addictions. She visited the Hope diamond in her bedroom safe sometimes, taking it out and holding it under lamplight. The stone was beautiful and cold and had outlasted everything else. Her son was dead, her husband was institutionalized, her daughter was uncontrollable. The friendship she had built through parties had evaporated. The diamond remained, unchanged, waiting for whatever came next. Ned died in 1941 at Shepherd Pratt from complications of liver failure and pneumonia. He was 55. Evalyn received a phone call from the hospital. She arranged the funeral and attended wearing black and the Hope diamond. The service was small. Some people came out of obligation. The newspapers mentioned his death briefly. The Washington Post, which he had inherited and ruined, ran a short obituary that did not mention the Teapot Dome scandal or the years in the asylum. Evalyn was a widow at 55, freed from a marriage that had ended decades earlier. In March 1932, the Lindbergh baby was kidnapped from his home in New Jersey. The case dominated headlines for weeks. Charles Lindbergh was America's hero, the aviator who had flown solo across the Atlantic. His 20-month-old son had been taken from his crib in the night. Ransom notes arrived demanding $50,000. The nation waited for resolution. Evalyn read every article with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The case was exactly what she had feared for her own children. Wealthy family, vulnerable child. Criminals willing to exploit both. She had spent years building security around Vincent and young Evalyn and Nettie, and still Vincent had died. The Lindberghs had presumably taken precautions, and their child was gone. The randomness of it consumed her. 2 weeks after the kidnapping, a man named Gaston Means contacted her. He claimed to have connections to the kidnappers. He said they would negotiate only through him, and only with someone who understood discretion. He had chosen Evalyn because she was wealthy, well-connected, and known for protecting her own children. He could arrange the baby's return, he said, but it would require money and complete secrecy. Evalyn met with him at Friendship. Means was smooth, confident, specific in his details. He said the kidnappers were part of an organized gang. They had the baby safe and would return him unharmed if the ransom was paid properly. The official ransom was $50,000, but the gang wanted more, $100,000 total. The additional money would ensure the baby's safety and guarantee no future attempts on Lindbergh children. She asked why the kidnappers would trust him. Means explained he had worked with them before on other criminal matters. He was a go-between, a negotiator. He had been a Justice Department investigator before being fired for corruption. He knew how criminals thought. He could handle the exchange in ways the police could not. Evalyn wanted to believe him. The alternative was accepting that the baby might die and that she could do nothing. Means offered control or the appearance of it. She asked what he needed. He said $100,000 in cash, small bills, unmarked. She would give him the money. He would negotiate with the kidnappers. The baby would be returned within a week. She withdrew $100,000 from her bank. The transaction required special arrangements. That much cash was not typically available immediately. The bank manager asked about the withdrawal. She told him it was for a private investment. He processed the request without further questions. The money was delivered to Friendship in a locked case. Means took the cash and left. He said he would contact her within 48 hours with updates. 2 days passed, no contact. 3 days, nothing. A week. Evalyn began calling the number he had given her. No answer. She sent her driver to the address where Means claimed to live. The building superintendent said no one by that name lived there. She realized slowly that she had been robbed. Means had invented the entire story. There was no connection to the kidnappers. There was no negotiation. He had identified a desperate, wealthy woman and had told her exactly what she needed to hear. She had given him $100,000 based on nothing except his confidence and her fear. The Lindbergh baby's body was found in May, 2 months after the kidnapping. The child had been dead for weeks, killed the night of the abduction. All the ransom negotiations, all the hopes for safe return, had been theater. The baby had never been recoverable. Evalyn read the news and felt the weight of her mistake compound. She had lost $100,000 trying to save a child who was already dead. She had been manipulated by a con artist who had understood exactly how grief and fear could override judgment. She considered not reporting the theft. Admitting what had happened would make her look foolish and desperate, which she was. But the money was substantial enough that its disappearance would be noticed. She contacted the FBI. The agents who interviewed her were polite but skeptical. They asked why she had not verified Means's claims before giving him money. She had no good answer. They asked if she had contacted the Lindbergh family. She had not. Means had insisted on secrecy. The agents exchanged glances that suggested they had seen this pattern before. Gaston Means was arrested in June. He had spent the money quickly: gambling debts, luxury expenses, payments to associates. Almost none of it was recoverable. Means was charged with embezzlement and larceny. The trial was in 1933. Evalyn was called to testify. She had to describe, in a public courtroom, how easily she had been deceived. The questioning was humiliating. The prosecutor asked her to explain the timeline, how long between meeting Means and giving him the money. 3 days, she said. Had she investigated his background? No. Had she asked for proof of his connection to the kidnappers? No. Had she consulted with the Lindbergh family or law enforcement? Number. Each answer made her judgment look worse. The defense attorney was worse. He suggested Evalyn had given Means the money willingly, knowing it was a scheme, because she enjoyed the attention of being involved in the famous case. The accusation was absurd but impossible to disprove. How could she prove her motives had been pure? She said she had wanted to help. The attorney asked why she had not helped through official channels. She had no answer that sounded rational. Means was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The conviction provided no satisfaction. The money was gone. The humiliation was public. The newspapers covered the trial extensively, describing Evalyn as a wealthy woman whose desperation had made her an easy target. The Washington Post, still technically part of the McLean empire, had to report on its owner's family being defrauded. Young Evalyn read the coverage and asked her mother how she could have been so stupid. The question was cruel and accurate. Evalyn had no defense. She had acted out of fear and grief, giving money to a stranger because he had offered a solution to something that had no solution. Her judgment had been destroyed by decades of believing that money could fix problems. The $100,000 was substantial even for her. The loss required selling property, a house in Washington that had been empty for years, some investments her father had made in railroads. The sales were handled quietly, but they represented contraction. For the first time in her life, Evalyn had less than she had before. She stopped reading newspapers after the trial. The coverage was too painful, not because it was unfair, but because it was accurate. She had been foolish and desperate and publicly humiliated. The Hope Diamond sat in her safe, worth far more than what she had lost. She considered selling it. Then she realized it was one of the few things she owned that could not be taken by con artists or bad judgment. Young Evalyn married in 1933, at age 21. The groom was a naval officer named William Kinsolving, from an old Maryland family with connections but little money. The wedding was at Friendship, a smaller affair than Evalyn had originally planned. The guest list was 200 instead of 500. Some of the most prominent families sent regrets. The McLean name had accumulated too much scandal. Teapot Dome, Ned's institutionalization, the Lindbergh ransom humiliation. Social capital had limits, and the McLeans had exceeded theirs. Evalyn watched her daughter marry a man she barely knew. The courtship had been brief, the engagement shorter. Young Evalyn wanted to leave friendship, wanted distance from her mother and the estate that felt like a mausoleum. Marriage was escape, nothing more. Evalyn recognized the pattern. She had married Ned for similar reasons. She said nothing. The warning she might have offered would have been hypocritical. The marriage failed within a year. Kinsolving was posted to naval assignments that took him away for months. Young Evalyn stayed in Washington, drinking and attending parties without her husband. The separation became permanent by mutual disinterest. They did not divorce immediately. Divorce still required public proceedings and specific grounds. Instead, they simply stopped living together. Young Evalyn moved back to friendship. She was different when she returned, harder, more reckless. She had inherited her father's alcoholism and her mother's depression. The combination was lethal. She would drink through entire days, starting with champagne at breakfast and progressing to whiskey by afternoon. Evalyn would find her unconscious in various rooms of the estate. The servants learned to check on her regularly. Young Evalyn began using morphine. A doctor had prescribed it for headaches, the same diagnosis that had justified Evelyn's own laudanum use. But young Evalyn used it differently, not for pain management, but for obliteration. She would inject it and disappear into stupors that lasted hours. Evalyn found the needles and confronted her daughter. Young Evalyn laughed. "You've been taking laudanum for 20 years, she said. "Don't lecture me about drugs." The argument was unanswerable. Evalyn had spent decades medicating herself into functional numbness. Her daughter was doing the same thing with different substances. The moral authority required to intervene did not exist. Evalyn tried anyway, hiring doctors to examine young Evalyn, to recommend treatments. The doctors prescribed rest cures and dietary changes. Young Evalyn ignored all of it. By 1935, young Evalyn's addiction was undeniable. She would disappear for days, showing up at hotels in Washington or Baltimore with no memory of how she had gotten there. She wrecked cars. She was asked to leave restaurants. She attended parties and made scenes, crying, shouting, accusing people of conspiracies against her. The behavior was identical to Ned's deterioration, playing out faster and in public. Evalyn tried to contain the damage. She paid hotel bills and bar tabs. She settled with people young Evalyn had offended. She hired staff to follow her daughter and intervene before situations became criminal. The expenses were constant. More importantly, the effort was futile. Young Evalyn was determined to destroy herself and had the resources to do it efficiently. In April 1946, Evalyn received a call from a hotel in Los Angeles. Her daughter had been found unresponsive in a room she had checked into under a false name. The hotel manager had gone through her belongings looking for identification and had found Evalyn's contact information. Young Evalyn had been taken to a hospital. The doctors were not optimistic. Evalyn took a train to Los Angeles, a 3-day journey that felt endless. She arrived to find her daughter in a hospital bed unconscious, breathing, but barely. The doctors explained that young Evalyn had taken a massive dose of morphine, probably combined with alcohol. The overdose had caused respiratory failure. They had stabilized her, but the damage was extensive. Brain function was compromised. Recovery was unlikely. Young Evalyn died 2 days later without regaining consciousness. She was 34 years old. The death certificate listed the cause as accidental overdose, though the doctors privately suggested it might have been suicide. Evalyn would never know. Her daughter had left no note, no explanation. Nothing except a hotel room full of empty bottles and used needles. The body was brought back to Washington. The funeral was at Friendship, attended by fewer than 50 people. Many of the families who had known young Evalyn as a child sent regrets. The service was brief. Evalyn stood at the gravesite wearing black and the Hope Diamond, watching her second child be buried. She felt nothing that resembled grief, just a vast numbness that the laudanum intensified into complete dissociation. Neddy, now 31, attended the funeral and left immediately after. He had his own problems, failed business ventures, debts his mother paid, drinking that had not yet reached his sister's level but was heading there. He and Evalyn had little to say to each other. He lived in New York, occasionally asking for money, rarely visiting. The family was three people who shared a name and nothing else. After the funeral, Evalyn returned to the empty mansion. Young Evalyn's rooms were left untouched, clothes in the closet, photographs on the dresser, evidence of a life that had ended badly. The servants asked if they should pack the belongings. Evalyn told them to leave everything. She could not bring herself to erase the rooms, even though she never entered them. She began drinking more heavily. The combination of alcohol and laudanum created states where hours would pass unremembered. She would find herself in different rooms with no memory of moving. The servants would guide her to bed when she became too disoriented to navigate the house. The doctors continued prescribing whatever she asked for. No one suggested she had a problem. Friendship felt larger than ever. The estate had been built for parties, for crowds, for noise and movement. Now it held one woman and the staff required to maintain her. The ballroom sat empty. The pool was drained. The tennis courts grew weeds. The property that had represented social triumph had become a monument to absence. Evalyn would sit in the main parlor, where Vincent's body had been laid after the accident 27 years earlier. She would wear the Hope Diamond and drink whiskey and think about her children, one dead at 9 in an accident, one dead at 34 from an overdose, one alive but distant, drinking his way toward the same ending. She had given them everything money could buy, and nothing it could not. The results were visible. The curse was not supernatural. It was inheritance, of addiction, of depression, of the emptiness that wealth created and then filled with substances that made the emptiness briefly tolerable. Her children had learned from her example. They had watched her medicate herself through grief and boredom and meaninglessness. They had copied the pattern exactly. The financial pressure began quietly in the late 1940s. Evalyn had always spent without consideration. The mining fortune and the McLean inheritance had seemed infinite. But decades of maintaining multiple properties, hosting elaborate parties, paying for scandals, and funding addictions had eroded the foundation. The income from investments no longer covered the expenses of her lifestyle. The first indication was a meeting with her financial advisors in 1946, shortly after young Evalyn's death. They presented ledgers showing expenditures exceeding income for 3 consecutive years. The deficit was being covered by selling stocks and bonds. At the current rate, they explained, she would need to liquidate major assets within 5 years. They recommended reducing household staff, selling unused properties, curtailing expenses. Evalyn listened and dismissed their concerns. She had been wealthy her entire adult life. The idea that money could actually run out seemed theoretical, a problem for people who had less to begin with. She told the advisors to manage it. They explained that management required her cooperation, decisions about which properties to sell, which expenses to cut. She told them to do whatever was necessary and left the meeting. The I Street mansion in Washington was sold first in 1947. She had not lived there in years. Friendship had been her primary residence since the 1920s. The house sold for less than it had cost to furnish. The new owners were a diplomat and his family. They took possession immediately. Evalyn did not attend the closing. The house was emptied by staff who packed decades of belongings into storage. The sale provided temporary relief, but did not solve the underlying problem. Friendship cost over $200,000 per year to maintain. Staff salaries, groundskeeping, utilities, repairs to a mansion that was falling into disrepair. The parties that had justified the expense had stopped. The estate was maintained for no purpose, except that Evalyn lived there and could not imagine living anywhere else. The financial advisors returned in 1948 with more urgent warnings. The investment portfolio was depleted. Income from the Camp Bird mine, her father's original gold strike, had declined as the ore veins thinned. The Washington Post, still technically part of the McLean estate, though Evalyn had no control over it, was losing money and contributing nothing to her income. Major assets needed to be sold. She agreed to sell the Hope Diamond. The decision came during a laudanum haze, a moment when the idea of keeping a cursed necklace seemed absurd compared to maintaining solvency. The diamond was appraised at over $1 million. She contacted Harry Winston, the New York jeweler who specialized in extraordinary stones. Winston examined the diamond and made an offer. He would purchase it for several $100,000 less than the appraisal, with payments structured over several years. Evalyn accepted. The Hope Diamond was packed and shipped to New York in November 1949. She watched the courier leave Friendship carrying a small box that contained 45 carats of blue stone and 60 years of mythology. The diamond had been with her for 38 years, longer than her marriage, longer than any of her children had lived. It left without ceremony. The money from the diamond sale disappeared quickly. Debts were paid, expenses were covered, and within a year, the infusion was absorbed. The advisors recommended selling Friendship. The estate was worth millions. The sale would provide enough income to live comfortably for the rest of her life, assuming she moved somewhere smaller and reduced her lifestyle. She refused. Friendship was the only thing that remained from the life she had built. The mansion held 50 years of memories, parties where senators had danced, dinners where Supreme Court justices had argued, weekends when she had believed she mattered to the people who attended. Selling it would mean admitting that all of it had been temporary, that the social position she had purchased through hospitality had dissolved and left nothing. But the expenses could not be sustained. The staff was reduced from 40 to 20, then to 12. Sections of the house were closed off. The grounds were maintained minimally. The gardens grew wild. The pool remained empty. The tennis courts disappeared under vegetation. The estate that had been immaculate became visibly neglected. Evalyn moved her living quarters to a small section of the main house: a bedroom, a sitting room, a bathroom. The rest of the mansion remained furnished but unused. She would walk through empty ballrooms where chandeliers hung over dust-covered floors. The silence was total. 75 rooms occupied by one woman and a skeleton staff of servants who had nowhere else to go. Her son Nettie visited once in 1950. He needed money for another failed business venture. Evalyn gave him $10,000 she could not afford to give. He stayed one night, uncomfortable in the decaying mansion, and left the next morning. He would die 2 years later of a heart attack at age 37, the third of her 4 children to die before her. The news reached her by telegram. She attended the funeral but remembered almost nothing about it afterward. The jewelry was sold piece by piece through the early 1950s. Necklaces, bracelets, rings that had cost tens of thousands were auctioned for fractions of their original price. Evalyn kept almost nothing. A few personal items, her wedding ring from a marriage that had ended decades earlier. The rest was liquidated to pay bills. The art collection followed. Paintings by Corot and Millet that had hung in the mansion since the 1900s were sold to dealers. Sculptures were auctioned. The library of first editions was purchased by a university. Each sale represented another concession, another admission that the wealth was finite and nearly exhausted. By 1951, Friendship itself was being evaluated for sale. Real estate agents toured the property, taking notes on necessary repairs. The roof leaked in multiple places. The plumbing was failing. The electrical system was outdated and dangerous. The cost to restore the mansion to livable condition exceeded its market value. The agents suggested demolition. The land was worth more empty than burdened with a deteriorating 75-room mansion. Evalyn was 65 years old, in declining health and running out of options. The estate that had been the center of her life for 30 years was unsellable except as a teardown. The fortune that had seemed infinite was nearly gone. The children were dead or estranged. The parties had stopped. The friends had vanished. The Hope Diamond was in a vault in New York, owned by someone else. She sat in her small section of the enormous house, drinking whiskey and taking laudanum, watching the empire her father had built in Colorado mining camps dissolve into debt and neglect. The curse had not required supernatural intervention. Time and expense and poor judgment had been sufficient. In 1952, Evalyn was forced to leave Friendship. The estate was sold to the Catholic Church, which planned to demolish the mansion and build a school on the land. The sale price was far less than what the property had been worth a decade earlier. The mansion's deterioration had destroyed most of its value. After settling debts and outstanding expenses, Evalyn was left with enough to live on, but nothing resembling the wealth she had once commanded. She moved to a small apartment at the Ambassador Hotel in Washington. The transition from a 75-room estate to a 3-room hotel suite was absolute. The furniture from Friendship would not fit. Most of it was sold or placed in storage she could not afford to maintain. She kept a few pieces: a chair her father had purchased in 1902, a desk that had belonged to her mother. The rest was dispersed to auction houses and antique dealers. The hotel apartment was clean and adequately furnished. It had a bedroom, a sitting room, and a bathroom. The staff maintained it. Meals could be ordered from the hotel restaurant. It was comfortable in the way that expensive hotels were comfortable, impersonal, and temporary. Evalyn had spent 50 years accumulating houses and now lived in rooms that belonged to someone else. She was 66 years old and in poor health. The decades of laudanum and alcohol had destroyed her liver and damaged her heart. She needed assistance walking. A nurse was hired to check on her daily, to manage medications, to ensure she ate. The nurse found her employer difficult, demanding, and confused, cycling between clarity and stupor depending on what she had taken. The social life that had defined her existence was completely gone. She knew no one in the hotel. The few remaining acquaintances from her Washington years did not visit. She was a relic of an earlier era, a woman who had once hosted senators and Supreme Court justices and was now living alone in a hotel. The telephone in her apartment rarely rang. She would take walks occasionally, driven by the hotel's car service to places she had once owned or frequented. She visited the site where Friendship had been. The mansion was gone, demolished within months of the sale. A construction site occupied the land, foundations for the school being poured, workers moving earth where her ballroom had stood. She watched through the car window for 10 minutes, then asked the driver to leave. She visited the I Street mansion, which had been converted into offices. The exterior was unchanged, but the interior had been gutted. The ballroom where she had hosted hundreds was now divided into small rooms with filing cabinets and desks. She asked to go inside once. The current occupants, not knowing who she was, turned her away. She stood on the sidewalk looking at windows that had once been hers. The apartment filled with medical equipment, an oxygen tank for her worsening breathing, a wheelchair for days when walking was impossible. Prescription bottles lined the bathroom counter: painkillers, sedatives, heart medication, sleeping pills. The nurse managed the schedule, but Evalyn supplemented freely, taking extra doses when the pain or boredom became intolerable. She read newspapers occasionally, looking for names she recognized. Most of the people she had known were dead or had left Washington. The social columns mentioned parties and events she was not invited to. The city had continued without her. The Washington she had tried to join in 1901 and had briefly dominated in the 1920s no longer existed. Alice Roosevelt Longworth, who had been the closest thing Evalyn had to a friend, visited once in 1953. The meeting was brief and awkward. Alice was still sharp, still connected to Washington society. Evalyn was diminished, sitting in a hotel apartment in a bathrobe. They spoke about people they had both known. Alice mentioned parties Evalyn had hosted decades earlier. The conversation had the quality of archaeology, examining a past that felt impossibly distant. When Alice left, she did not suggest they meet again. Evalyn understood. There was nothing to maintain. The friendship had been based on proximity and utility. Both had vanished. Alice belonged to the Washington that still mattered. Evalyn belonged to a version that had ended. The days had no structure. She would wake late, take medications, eat minimally. The nurse would visit and check vital signs and leave. Hours would pass in the sitting room, staring at walls or at a television she barely watched. She had spent decades orchestrating elaborate parties, and now could not fill the hours of a single afternoon. She thought about her children frequently. Vincent, dead at 9. Young Evalyn, dead at 34. Nettie, dead at 37. Only one child had survived: John, born in 1918, who had left Washington years earlier and rarely contacted her. He had his own life in another city. He called occasionally, brief conversations that covered nothing. He did not visit. The guilt was constant, but shapeless. She could not identify specific failures. She had provided her children with everything money could purchase, but something in the providing had been wrong. The wealth had insulated them from consequences until the consequences became fatal. The security had created isolation. The privilege had produced people who could not function without it. She kept a single photograph on the desk, a family portrait from 1920, herself and Ned and all 4 children, taken at Friendship when the estate was at its peak. Everyone in the photograph was in costume for a party, dressed elaborately, smiling. She looked at it sometimes and tried to remember what she had felt that day. Nothing came. The image was evidence that the moment had happened, but the feelings were inaccessible. The money continued to diminish. The hotel was expensive. The nurses were expensive. The medications were expensive. Her advisors had structured the remaining assets to provide income, but the income was small and the expenses were constant. She was living on what amounted to an allowance from her own depleted fortune. In early 1947, she had worn the Hope Diamond to her daughter's funeral, the last time she owned it. By 1954, she could not afford the hotel apartment without selling more possessions. A lifetime of accumulation was being liquidated in reverse. The houses first, then the art, then the jewelry, then the furniture. What remained was medical equipment and a few personal items. She was 78 years old. The woman who had once purchased a cursed diamond on impulse now needed permission from financial advisors to buy a winter coat. The woman who had hosted parties for 300 lived in 3 rooms and spoke to almost no one except medical staff. The wealth had lasted longer than the things it was supposed to purchase. Connection, meaning, family, love, all of it had dissolved while the money was still being spent. She sat in the hotel apartment on most evenings, looking out the window at a city she no longer recognized, wearing a bathrobe and taking pills that made the hours pass without being felt. Evalyn died on April 26, 1947 at Washington General Hospital. The death certificate listed the cause as pneumonia, though her body had been failing in multiple ways for years. She was 61 years old. The nurse who had been checking on her daily had found her unconscious in the hotel apartment that morning. An ambulance was called. She never regained consciousness. There was no one at the hospital when she died. Her surviving son, John, was in California and could not be reached immediately. The few people who might have been notified were either dead themselves or had drifted beyond contact. A hospital chaplain was present in the room, a stranger performing his professional duty. Evalyn Walsh McLean died alone, except for a priest who did not know her. The funeral was held 4 days later at the Church of the Epiphany in Washington. The guest list was small, fewer than 100 people. Some came out of social obligation to a family that had once mattered. Others came out of curiosity to see the end of a woman whose life had been documented in newspapers for decades. The service was brief. The minister spoke about faith and redemption in language that applied to anyone, and therefore no one specifically. John McLean attended and sat in the front pew. He was 29 years old, the only one of Evalyn's 4 children to survive her. He showed little emotion during the service. After the burial at Rock Creek Cemetery, he left Washington immediately. He would live another 3 decades, but would rarely speak publicly about his mother or his family. The obituaries were respectful and detailed. The Washington Post ran a full column describing her life: the mining fortune, the marriage to Ned McLean, the ownership of the Hope Diamond, the elaborate parties at Friendship. The article mentioned Vincent's death and young Evalyn's death, but provided no details about the circumstances. The Teapot Dome scandal was referenced briefly. Ned's institutionalization was described as illness. The obituary presented a curated version of her life, softened and simplified. Other newspapers were less generous. The New York Times obituary focused on the Hope Diamond and the curse, listing the tragedies that had befallen Evalyn: dead children, institutionalized husband, financial decline. The article noted that she had once been one of the wealthiest women in America and had died in a hotel apartment. The contrast was the story, not the woman herself. The estate liquidation began immediately. Evalyn had left debts, unpaid medical bills, outstanding hotel charges, loans taken against future income that had not materialized. The creditors filed claims. John McLean, as executor, was responsible for settling them. The remaining assets were minimal: some furniture and storage, a few pieces of jewelry, stocks and bonds worth less than the debts they needed to cover. The Hope Diamond, which Evalyn had sold to Harry Winston in 1949, remained in Winston's possession. He would later donate it to the Smithsonian Institution in 1958, where it remains on display. The stone outlasted everyone who had owned it, unchanged and unconcerned. Visitors to the museum would read about the curse and look at the diamond and never think about the woman who had worn it for 38 years. Friendship, the estate that had been the center of Evelyn's social life, was already gone. The Catholic Church had demolished the mansion in 1952 and built a school on the property. By the time of Evelyn's death, no physical trace of the house remained. The ballroom where senators had danced existed only in photographs and aging memories. The I Street mansion in Washington had been converted to offices years earlier. The subsequent owners had no connection to the McLean family and no interest in preserving its history. The house would eventually be demolished in the 1960s to make room for a commercial building. The location where Evelyn had first entertained Washington society became a parking lot. The jewelry that Evelyn had not already sold was auctioned. Pieces that had once been photographed in society pages were dispersed to private collectors. A bracelet Ned had given her during their honeymoon sold for $300. A necklace her father had purchased in 1905 sold for $800. The prices were unremarkable. The items had no historical significance beyond their association with a family that was already being forgotten. The furniture from Friendship and the I Street house was sold in lots to antique dealers. A desk that had belonged to Thomas Walsh was purchased by a collector in Philadelphia. Chairs that had seated Supreme Court justices were bought by a hotel in Baltimore. The objects scattered across the country, disconnected from their context, reduced to items valued only for their craftsmanship or age. The personal items, photographs, letters, diaries, were given to John McLean, who placed them in storage and never examined them. Years later, a portion would be donated to the Library of Congress. Researchers would occasionally review the materials for papers on Washington society or the Teapot Dome scandal. Most of the collection would remain untouched, boxes in a climate-controlled facility containing the documentary evidence of a life that had stopped mattering. The gravestone at Rock Creek Cemetery was modest, a simple marker with her name and dates. No epitaph, no description, nothing to indicate the wealth or the parties or the tragedy. The grave was next to Vincent's, the 9-year-old son who had died in 1919. Young Evelyn and Nettie were buried elsewhere. The family that had once been one of the wealthiest in America was scattered across different cemeteries, the graves visited by almost no one. Within 5 years of Evelyn's death, she had largely disappeared from public memory. The social columns that had once chronicled her parties no longer mentioned her. The politicians who had attended Friendship were retired or dead. The Washington she had dominated had transformed into something unrecognizable. The city moved forward without preserving or acknowledging the people who had briefly mattered within it. The few people who remembered her at all remembered the Hope Diamond first, the woman second. She became a footnote to the curse mythology, another owner who had lost children and money and died diminished. The diamond story required tragic owners to validate the curse. Evelyn served that narrative purpose efficiently. The liquidation concluded in 1949. All debts were settled. The remaining funds were distributed to John McLean, a sum so small it barely registered against the fortune his grandfather Thomas Walsh had extracted from Colorado gold 50 years earlier. The mining empire, the newspaper dynasty, the social prominence, all of it had been converted to cash and dispersed to creditors and auctioneers. Nothing remained except objects in museums, photographs in archives, and graves in cemeteries that no one visited. The McLean family existed only as historical record, names on documents, evidence that they had once been present and were now completely gone. The Hope Diamond sits in the Smithsonian now behind glass, under lights that make the blue stone appear to glow from within. Millions of people see it every year. They read the placard about the curse, about the owners who died or went mad or lost everything. Evalyn Walsh McLean is mentioned, one name in a list of tragedies the stone supposedly caused. But the diamond did not cause anything. It was just a piece of carbon, compressed and cut, valuable only because people agreed it was valuable. Evelyn wore it for 38 years, and it sat against her throat, cold and inert, while her children died and her husband deteriorated and her fortune dissolved. The curse was simply time and the particular way her life arranged itself around absences that money could not fill. She spent 61 years trying to purchase belonging, first in Denver, then in Washington, then at Friendship, where she built a stage for intimacy and filled it with people who left when the weekends ended. The parties were real. The guests came. But whatever she was trying to create through hospitality never materialized. The relationships remained transactional until they stopped being worth the transaction. Her father had pulled gold from mountains and believed it would transform his family into something permanent. It transformed them into people who could afford anything and could not keep their children alive. 3 of her 4 children died before she did. The wealth that was supposed to protect them may have done the opposite, insulating them from consequences until the consequences became fatal, providing resources for addictions that killed efficiently. The estates are gone. Friendship was demolished. The I Street mansion became a parking lot. The jewelry was sold and scattered. Her grave at Rock Creek Cemetery is simple and rarely visited. What remains is documentation: photographs of parties, auction records for diamonds, newspaper coverage of scandals. The evidence that she existed is cataloged and archived and mostly unexamined. She wanted to matter. She built monuments to that want: houses, parties, collections. But monuments require maintenance, and eventually there is no one left who cares enough to maintain them. The stone survives. The woman who wore it is forgotten, except as context for the stone's mythology. What the wealth could not buy was obvious only in retrospect. By then, it was already gone,